Hello, and welcome to the BP Learning Mindcast Ridecast. I've decided to start putting both my podcast making and my bike rides together into one activity. So this will be a little bit of an experiment for me and for you to see if this can be successful, see if the wind noise doesn't drown out what I'm saying, and see if maybe the increased blood flow gives me newer and fresher ideas than even before. So anyway, I hope you join us in our journey, and I hope you enjoy. If you're on video, I hope you enjoy the scenery and the content. All right, so in this episode, I wanted to talk about the social construction of knowledge. And this is something that's gotten quite a little buzz lately. And the social construction of knowledge basically means that there is not a objective way of obtaining knowledge generally. That science is a socially constructed enterprise, as is math. And we could potentially, at least, do things a different way and come out with different results and different ideas because of this social construction. And so this has been widely derided by people who are trying to defend science and math, because there's certainly a lot of people trying to destroy or remove science and math. And I will say that both the proponents and detractors have something reasonable to say. And my view is that, to put it shortly, yes, knowledge is socially constructed, but no, it's not arbitrary, and that we can actually do better to see and understand our world and to correct our misunderstandings, correct science when it goes wrong, if we recognize that it's socially constructed. And so, as I said, I don't think there's anything wrong with being socially constructed. And in fact, I think some of the parts of it are as definitively true as you might imagine. But just because something is true does not mean that it is not also socially constructed. So what does socially constructed mean? Well, socially constructed means that the results depend on an agreement between the participants. An agreement of some sort, that it's a social agreement. So, for example, let's say that, actually this is a good example, in our homeschool community, we have decided that if you have gotten COVID, you are only allowed back after a test that confirms that you no longer have COVID. Now, we also have exceptions to that, but let's just hang out with just that rule. All right, so what the rule says, now, I can't know in actuality if someone really has COVID, and neither can anyone else. What we can do is we can say, well, what are our community's standards for deciding who has COVID and who doesn't? And what we have determined is that the tests, though fallible, match what our community is trying to do as far as it comes to fighting COVID. So we have established a community standard for knowledge. In this case, it's knowledge of whether or not somebody has COVID. And so it is socially constructed in that we could have defined other standards for not having COVID. We could have gone based on symptoms. We could have gone based on number of days. from the onset, and all of these are imperfect ways of describing whether or not someone has COVID. But ultimately, any given community has to decide what they're going to take as evidence, and even what they're going to take as bare truth. And we've got to decide, what is it that is our standard? What's our standard for truth? And so in our community, we have made a decision on what the standard of truth is. Now you might be thinking, well, yes, but your standard of truth is based on science because you're doing tests. Well, again, you could back that up a notch and say, okay, well, what about the tests? Well, the tests themselves are based on community-driven standards of truth. And so they'll be like, first of all, hold on a second, I can hide these guys. Afternoon. So, for instance, for any given set of data, there's a possibility to arrive at that data out of chance. So, for example, anytime you do a science experiment, there is a certain percentage of chance that you might hit what you think your theory is. You might prove your theory accidentally, like the theory isn't true, but the data, by chance, lines up with what you're wanting to prove. Now, what we've done in science is we've used statistics to make that as rare of an occurrence as possible. But it's not something that can be ruled out. And the decision of which features are ruled in and ruled out are based on social construction. Even with math. With math, you have proofs, and proofs, what counts as a proof, varies by social construction. So, as an example, typically, there's a set of theorems called ZFC. And typically anything, in modern day mathematics, things that can be proved with ZFC are considered proven. Well, that core set of axioms, again, was based on social construction. In fact, we can see this kind of clearly in the case of geometry, where it turns out that some of Euclid's axioms were not at their core level true. They're actually conditional, and you could actually come out with non-Euclidean geometries. Now, there is in fact some sort of a limit to all this, and that is when you get down to bare logic, you wind up with things where, and you actually can't prove logic to be true either. What you can do, however, is you can say, either this is true or we can't find truth, right? So there's certain areas of logic, so you can show that if certain rules of logic aren't true, then the world is unintelligible or pointless or contradictory. And so, again, this is social. I believe it to be true, but it's socially constructed. Someone could, in fact, choose a different way. I think that if something shows that if you hold an idea that renders the rest of the world unintelligible or nonsense, then you have more than enough grounds to reject that idea. So if idea A makes the world nonsense, then holding that idea can be rejected because the world isn't nonsense. And if it was nonsense, then it wouldn't matter if it was nonsense. So anyway, so kind of the core rules of logic can generally be justified on that basis. Now again, that's a social construction. It's a good social construction. I happen to heartily agree with that social construction. But some other social construction could say that no, anything that's possible we're not going to rule out. That would be a possible social construction. And so in fact, even at the level of the laws of logic, the idea that knowledge isn't socially constructed is basically false. Now you might say, hey John, you can't talk about truth and falsity without social construction by your own definition, and I agree. But my point about social construction isn't that social construction means something is wrong. I think there are great social constructions. In fact, society prospered long before we had solid science and math. And we prospered by finding truth with other forms of social construction. So, I don't think being a social construction actually causes us any particular worry about the sciences and math that don't also come up and say eating, drinking, and sleeping. So, on your right. So, social construction doesn't mean it's bad. What it means is simply there's been kind of idolatry that's developed around science and math that makes us think that it can't be wrong, that it's immune to objection, and that something is found out in science or math that we are all required by virtue of being mentally virtuous to accept that. And so when you note that it's socially constructed, you kind of take away the idolatrous power of math and science. It's not to say they're wrong. I mean, I do math. My job is based largely on math and science. I do computer programming. And math and science didn't work, neither would computer programming. However, that doesn't mean that we are infallible in those areas. And in fact, the fact that a lot of the knowledge is socially constructed means that our social construction of that might be wrong. There might be areas where we were accepting as social construction things that were wrong. We were too permissive in what we allowed. Maybe we were too stringent in what we rejected. Maybe we imported some axioms that we shouldn't. All in all, what this means is not that we should just ditch the processes of math and science because we're socially constructed, but that we shouldn't worship them. And so, anyway, my own career, my own academic career is kind of a testimony to that. One of the things that I've done is I've shown that one of the ways that they've been teaching in calculus to write one of its fundamental things known as the second derivative is incorrect, and that we've only actually been able to get by with it because of a giant kludge, and that if you actually write the second derivative out correctly, you no longer need the kludge. And for those of you more mathematically inclined, the kludge is it's the chain rule for the second derivative. And anyway, if you want to know more about that, there's a paper I wrote called, on your left, there's a paper I wrote called Extending the Algebraic Manipulability of Differentials. And it was peer-reviewed. It was actually reviewed post-publication as well in Mathematics magazine. So if you think I'm just full of it, well, you never know. I might be, but you can at least decide for yourself. And you can recognize that other people can see the value in what I'm saying as well. But nonetheless, this is a pretty core staple of calculus that's been taught this way for 150 years that, in my view, is incorrect. Now, some mathematicians will say, well, John, you're not wrong, but that doesn't actually make it incorrect. And so that's a whole other debate in itself. But all that to say is that just because there's a large segment of academia that supports a view, and even supports a view rigorously, does not all of a sudden make it not socially constructed. On your left. And so, anyway, so what's this all mean? Well, there's a whole thing about whether math is important, whether 2 + 2 = 5, and all sorts of things like that. And I think we can acknowledge the social construction of math without having to, say, oh, we need to tell little Billy that it's okay if he writes 2 + 2 = 5. Because it might be true that by some definitions of 2 + 2 we can get 5. I'm having trouble imagining those. I can more easily see a definition where 2 + 2 is 0. That's if you use modular arithmetic. But sure, there might be some place where 2 + 2 = 5. But anyway, that's not really helpful to Billy. What Billy needs to know is how to take the core of what humanity has figured out and apply it to his daily life. Now, some of that involves exploration and knowing how to explore. And knowing how to explore, knowing that math is socially constructed, is helpful. But on the whole, for someone who's 12 years old, they just need to be taught how to do it. Later in life, we can talk about, is this the best way? How did we come up with this? All that kind of stuff. And those are all good conversations to have. I think pretending that they're not even conversations gives the enemies of objectivity their power. You have to recognize that, yes, this is a question worth talking about. It's something worth describing. But it doesn't mean what a lot of people think it means. So another thing is that a lot of people have been talking about math as part of white cultural imperialism, which, here's the deal. It's like if I discover something brand new and I give it to everyone for free, that's not imperialism. That's the opposite of imperialism. Imperialism is if I come and take something from you and don't let you use it. That's imperialism. Math, on the other hand, occurs when I found out something about nature, about life, about logic, and I'm going to tell other people about it. And you know what? There's nothing, and literally the Constitution guarantees that nobody can prevent that information from being spread. So that means anyone can partake in it, which means that rather than math being imperialistic, it's the opposite. It's anti-imperialistic because it gives to everyone it touches. And likewise, for the most part, with science. Now, in the case of science, there's more of an opportunity to be imperialistic because there's all sorts of places where you can have human experimentation. You have data that gets locked in a lab. You have more malfeasances that are possible with science than with math. But nonetheless, on the whole, we teach things about science so that people can better live their lives. Now, the question is, are there other ways to understand the world other than math and science? The answer is, sure there are. And there's nothing in math and science, except for those who idolatrize them. Is that a word? I hope it is. Except for those who idolatrize them, there's nothing in math and science that forces you to use them all the time. In fact, you are purely at your own wisdom and leisure to decide when math and science are applicable and when they're not. So anyway, math doesn't take anything from anyone. It just gives things. And I'll speak another word in favor of the objectivity of math. Again, we're going back to the things that are, if you take the barest, most rudimentary thing is that we shouldn't hold something to be true if it makes nonsense of the world. And so math, actually at its base, math has the pieces that are kind of at its core, the things that must be true, that if they weren't true, would make nonsense of the world. That's why math's a little bit more objective than science is, but actually that's logic, but there's math that's built on logic. And so for instance, no matter what collection you might imagine of truisms that are true in the world, there's some other world that you might be able to imagine that has a different set of collection of axioms, different set of truths. And so you can see just right there, I have implicitly the number 2. I've got 2 different things. And from there, you can easily get from there to the counting numbers. And so you can see that some of these axioms are actually, with math, a lot of these things, although there's other ways to construct them, the ways that they're constructed typically really are the right ones because they're the ones that you can't escape from. They're the ones that make all the other knowledge understandable. And so, I think that's a pretty good start for knowledge. Again, we shouldn't hide from the fact that there is a social construction involved. There's a certain set of standards that I just used that are dependent on my sociology. I do, in fact, want to make sense of the world. Not everybody does. Some people like it being a mystery. So, anyway, but nonetheless, I think that on the whole, I think that social construction doesn't take away, because I think again, because I'm not an idolater of math and science, I think that people generally come up with pretty good ways to determine truth and falsity. And that when we have discussions, we argue, we philosophize, we discuss, we debate, I think that, which is a social convention, tends to produce at least pretty good ideas. Might not be perfect ideas, but at least pretty good. So I am not opposed to social construction, because even the idea that we shouldn't choose nonsense, again, that's a social construction, but it's a good one and most people hold to it. So I'm not concerned about social construction unless I'm also concerned about people. And so I think another reason people want to hold against social construction is they want to pretend that the people in science don't matter. And so if the people in science do matter, if who's doing science matters, then all of a sudden it's back to being a social construction. And some people want to avoid that. But it does matter. And so anyway, I'll conclude there. I think I've covered most of the bases. But in short, math is true, but it's also a social construction. That doesn't make it less true. Doesn't mean that it's arbitrary. It just means that it's a people enterprise. People decide the rules, people figure out the truths, and it's possible that some of them, at least, people could figure out different ones. So anyway, I actually have a semi-proof for why we need to allow academic pluralism on this basis, but it's longer than I want to get into here. So I'm just going to close this podcast here with leaving you on that note.